welcome back to another episode of the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined by Josh Sullivan.
Hello.
Welcome, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hi.
Hi. Also, this past week, we celebrated a big day for Josh.
Hey, yeah, old.
Yeah. We won't tell your age.
No, that's okay.
But
I'm old.
Yeah, you've had 3 decades now.
Yeah, only 3.
Only 3 decades.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go with that. At least 3. Let's say at least 3.
Okay, so get this. So we had this really beautiful occasion where we baptized a number of young people in one day in our parish. Very beautiful. It was a very beautiful day. And this
17 or something.
yeah,
right?
17 young people in one
amazing.
morning. It was very beautiful. And it happened because, we were reaching out to families in the Catholic schools who maybe missed their opportunity for baptism. We want to provide the opportunity for baptism. So it was a really beautiful day. However, it got me thinking, and not just this occasion, but every time I baptize people, it got me thinking, the church asks specific things to parents and godparents on the day of the baptism. And I know, like, in the ritual book, maybe I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say this on our podcast, but, the text of the priest is there. Parents in requesting baptism for your child, you are undertaking the responsibility of making sure your child grows up in the Catholic faith, learns to love God's commandments, all that stuff. I kind of go off script, I kind of go off script there, and I say, this includes, providing a good example for your children in faith, which means bringing them to Sunday Mass, which is our obligation as Catholics, which means creating a culture of faith in your own family, being part of the Christian community, and celebrating faith at home yourself, like leading by example. Those are things I add.
Yeah.
And then I say to the parents, do you clearly understand the responsibility you're undertaking from this day forward? And not once in hundreds of people I've baptized has anyone ever said no. Everyone says yes, or I do, or we know, or whatever. People say just a thumbs up. I don't know. And then godparents, I give a really hard time to.
Yeah.
Godparents, the parents have just promised in front of the Lord, in front of me, the church's minister, that they are going to raise their child in the Catholic faith. Now, your responsibility, it's not just like a cute invitation to be godparents, to be friends. Like, you are now taking the spiritual care of this young person for the rest of their life. You have that responsibility. That's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
And people just think, they give a card and a gift, and then they think that's it.
They think it's an honor roll. The parents are just honoring them with this specific task of like, oh, we really like you. You're the godparent now.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, you see that with parents who choose godparents that aren't even Christian.
Yeah.
And then we have to be like, well, they can't.
Yeah, they have
So
to.
then they have to have that awkward conversation that you can't, or they just say, well, we don't want to come to your church to be baptized. It's like, okay. Anyways, that's not the point I'm making. Godparents, so it's like they just promise, but now that you have spiritual care over this child, you are also promising here in front of the church and in front of me, the church's minister, in front of your family and friends, that from this day forward, you are going to make sure that this child is raised in the Catholic faith. Yeah. And if the parents are failing in their obligation, which they just promised to, you have to step in. And I know sometimes it's awkward, but that's what you're agreeing to. And then I say, do you both clearly understand what you're undertaking from this day forward, like the responsibility you're undertaking from this day forward? And they always say yes, with conviction. Yeah. Sometimes I believe them.
Yeah.
And which leads me to think here. These promises that we make in front of the church, because oftentimes, you see parents bring children for baptism, then you never see them again. You see godparents stand in the place they say yes, then they don't see them again. They don't do anything to encourage their godchild to. So, what does it even mean to make a promise in front of the church anymore? Like, is it just such a low priority in people's lives that we just, at one time, I don't know, when we were younger, like, to give your word about something meant something. Yeah. My parents they would say like, do you mean that?
Yeah.
Or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Are you sure you mean that? Or people used to say, I give you my word. Right?
Yeah.
Does that even mean anything anymore?
Yeah, I don't think that's kind of romanticizing the past, or like, that you have this older idea of a promise that, your word is your bond. Or like, don't say it if you don't mean it.
Let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's
Yeah,
right from the
very
scriptures,
scriptural.
right?
Yeah.
So now I think we have kind of our understanding of a promise, or an understanding of we have a kind of contractual understanding of promises, or like an economic understanding. Well, I'll only do this if you fulfill your end of the thing. That it's not your honor, it's not your word, it's just an obligation between parties that can be broken at any point that those parties decide that they no longer want to kind of honor that agreement or that relationship.
So I'll do it as a godparent as long as the parents are really doing it and I don't have to do anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like that like as long as the parents decide that that's what they're doing, then I'll do it and I'll support them in it. Meaning I won't say don't do it. Like I don't know really what your
there's no
responsibility.
permanence attached.
Yeah.
That it's just like, I'll do this as long as I'm into it. Or
I feel like we have that a lot with different areas of the church too, because you have not only just at baptism do you stand at the front and say I do. You have these promises. You have that at confirmation. You say that, and we try to really rub that in, like really rub it into the kids, like really get it into their heads for confirmation. Just understanding exactly what they're saying and what the kind of promises they're making, and at that time, and we also instruct their parents the same kind of thing for confirmation. But you also have it at marriage. And I think that's right, Matt. I think we've stepped away from, at one time, a lot of our promises, a lot of our vows at the front used to be, we've got away from, they're more contractual now instead of covenant. At one time they were a covenant where we were making them a lifelong commitment, like when I said I do to my wife, when I made the vows to my wife, those are lifelong commitments. And there's no breaking those, you know what I mean? And that was the way that I made those commitments. But now people enter into a marriage with a prenup already in place. So that's that's not a covenant. That's not a covenant that can never be broken. That's a contract. And if we do break it up, this is how we're going to break it up, right? With a prenup. And so you're breaking away from the covenantal bond or the covenantal commitment and making it more contractual. And I feel like that's part of the reason is because we're more selfish.
Yeah, I would say that, like,
right?
Well, yeah, and just you could say even kind of the cultural movement towards this radical individualism. That is like, I'm accountable, not to another person. Like, I'm primarily accountable to myself. And we did an episode, this is years ago now, about marriage, and I characterized the contemporary view of marriage as a convenient social arrangement that ceases to be an arrangement at that point, which it ceases to be convenient. That is, it's just like you have two individuals who are really excited about a wedding, but then realize they actually have to have a marriage on the other end of that wedding. Right. And it's just like you have, and kind of the beauty of a covenantal or sacramental marriage is that you have, two individuals enter into a sacrament which unites two individuals, and that, makes them, something where the whole is greater than the sum of their parts. That it's not like I no longer belong to myself. I am accountable to my wife in a, profound way. That again, I think has been kind of lost with this contractual idea of marriage, and not being like permanently accountable to that promise or that vow.
Yeah, and you mentioned confirmation as well. Like there's other sacraments. So we have the baptism, we have confirmation, we have matrimony. There's holy orders. There's promises involved in holy orders. But I remember in confirmation class, Josh is involved in teaching confirmation. But there's always that story, where we send kids home with this newfound knowledge about the Eucharist. There was that story where the kid went home and said,
the kid went home. The kid wasn't even home. He was leaving the church, and I was standing there saying goodbye to everybody. Yeah. And the parent and the kid was like, "Oh, did you know that?" He's explaining
the
some
Eucharist
is really there and everything else. And the parent was like, "Oh yeah, we don't believe that," and just kind of like was just a no. And I heard that as I was leaving. I was like, "Oh my goodness, that's okay."
We just do like a whole session with people getting them excited that Jesus is present in the Eucharist, and then the parent just shuts it down right there on the way out, and then the kid feels stupid, like, "Oh my parent," because generally you look up to your parents.
Yeah,
well, my parents don't believe that, so why should I believe it? Yeah. Right. So, what happens? What is the consequence when people break the promise? Because in my example I use about baptism. it's pretty clear what you're getting yourself into. And godparents as well, godparents, what is the consequence for breaking those promises?
Yeah.
And do people, A, are they aware? B, do they care?
I think that's a good question. I don't think people are aware. I don't think people understand the seriousness of the covenant that they've made at those times, the bond that they're entering into, the wording of their yes be yes and their no be no. And I think that they're not taking it seriously enough. Part of it is the question then becomes there are different levels of promises, different levels of your word, maybe like for instance, if I said to a buddy, "Hey, listen, I'll meet you for coffee at 5," and then I just don't show up because something came up. That's a little bit different than me standing in front of a church vowing that this, that, or the other thing. Like those are different levels of seriousness to my word. But under full understanding and stating that you are full understanding and that you're going to adhere to this and everything else, I don't understand how people can say yes and then just not follow through. So do they really have an understanding of what's going on? And then what would be the consequence of those? So
let's look at something. So for example, we have promises in baptism, promises in confirmation, promises in marriage. So we know when someone's unfaithful to their promise in marriage, that leads to a whole bunch of problems in that relationship, right? So if someone has promised to be faithful, for example, and that doesn't happen, that causes a whole bunch of problems in the relationship, which could lead to a separation, right? So in the same, use of the promise, does it lead to a separation when someone who's promised spiritual care for their child at baptism, does it lead to a certain separation between yourself and God, who you've made a promise to?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah. So, in terms of consequences, you can almost think about it in terms of like two different types of consequences. So you have like the practical outcome of people violating the promises of their marriage and their marriage falling apart, and like there's tons of statistics and demographics on what this does to families, what this does to children, what this does when this becomes kind of the majority trend in culture. Like you have the practical consequences. But also, you have kind of the spiritual consequences. You have kind of the relational consequences that, in a lot of the examples that you gave, a lot of those promises come with rights and obligations. So when you kind of forfeit the rights associated with that role, with the godparent, of being kind of that role of influence, with being a spouse, of having all of the kind of fruits of marriage, you also kind of forfeit and any of the rights, any of the when you give up the obligations. So being in a position of spiritual influence or authority, if you undermine that by telling a kid that you're responsible for, that you don't actually believe what the church teaches, when you've made a solemn promise, a solemn profession, a declaration before a community, followed by the creed, followed by a statement of belief, that you believe that you. The consequence is, again, at a practical level, you kind of sacrifice your integrity because you're just your word is worth less than it would be if you kind of held it. But also, you're making that promise before God, and that's you may have to atone for that in the long term.
Yeah, because the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2101 says this: fidelity to promises made to God. So being faithful to those promises made to God is a sign of the respect owed to the divine majesty and a love for a faithful God. So being faithful to our promises to God shows our respect for the Lord. So that must mean that not being faithful to our promises, it shows a lack of respect for the Lord, maybe a lack of understanding of what we're actually doing. Think about what a priest makes promises when he receives the sacrament of holy orders. There's a promise to pray the liturgy of the hours. There's a promise to be celibate for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And there's a promise of obedience to the bishop. Those are promises made. What happens when a priest is unfaithful to those promises? I think it depends on the situation.
Yeah.
If a priest isn't praying their liturgy of the hours, for example, the consequence there, in my opinion, is it's going to be reflected in the type of ministry they're outputting. If they're not faithful to their prayer,
Yeah,
then
I think
you're going to see the consequence.
I
of
think
that
it's
in
very
prayer.
clear sometimes when we have pastors or priests that might not respect that promise, because you can tell it. You can tell it in every aspect of whether they're following through the Holy Spirit or their answers and the way that they're pastoring and the way that they're leading.
Yeah.
If they're trying to do it off their own brain,
Merit or their own. Yeah.
they can get by on some things, but not everything. Like the wisdom that's displayed through that the gift of holy orders, I think, comes with that promise of the liturgy of the hours. And I'm only just starting to understand that from doing the liturgy of the hours just in the morning. And I haven't made a promise to do that. I'm just doing it to understand that. But realizing my own internal reflection, but also some of the things I'm dealing with in everyday life, how the Psalms come alive, how those things kind of come alive. But taking that time to kind of self-reflect and deal with it. So a priest not doing it 5 times a day, it's evident versus someone just again, it's a job. It becomes a job instead of a vocation, and that is also going to come with all their, in their answers to you, in their their decision making and all that stuff. They're going to be making. It's going to be evident that they're not making this through the.
But I don't think I've heard of a priest being fired per se.
No,
because of not praying the liturgy of the hours.
No,
right?
no. I think it's just because you can see it in their ministry, like you said. I
Exactly.
think it's reflected in their ministry because they're not turning to God.
Whereas maybe the promise to celibacy,
That's a little bit
this is a
serious.
little different. So
Yeah.
there's been cases in the past where the sexual abuse of minors or something like that, like something serious that's criminal. Obviously, the priest has been relieved of his duties, charged criminally, maybe spent time in jail, whatever it might be.
There was even cases just now, I think, not in Rome, but they're dealing with stuff in other churches where it wasn't of minors, but it was of just infidelity. And so then again, same kind of thing, being relieved of their duty because maybe the abuse of the sacraments of confession or whatever the case might be, right? Like, and so there are seriousness in not only cases like that.
And then we see sometimes the consequences of priests who don't follow the promise of obedience to the bishop. Now, this is a very serious sort of promise that priests make. You promise obedience to the bishop and his successors.
Yeah.
Right. So I was ordained a transitional deacon by one bishop. By the time it was time for my priestly ordination, like a year later, I had another bishop, and then
have a
now
third
in my
bishop.
priestly ministry, I have another bishop. So when you make that promise, you don't know who your bishops will be, but you make that promise, and that's not to say that a priest, you're not just blindly. If you're not blindly obeying the bishop in matters that aren't that are contrary, let's say, to the gospel of the faith. But there are serious concerns when a bishop, when a priest is not obedient to the teachings or the guidance, the directives of the bishop, and sometimes you see that in big public cases, right? Whether people have right or wrong things to say on either side, but you do. My point here, I guess, is that you see consequences when those promises are broken, right? That gets me thinking here because there are promises, there are also vows. So priests make promises at their ordination, right? So do people when they get married, at confirmation, at baptism, they make promises. A vow is what? Like, what would be something a vow? A vow, to me, when I first think of vow, I think of like maybe a religious sister or a religious brother or someone who's part of a religious community. They make vows. They make vows sometimes of poverty, chastity. And obedience, maybe. Yeah. But so those aren't promises those are different. I mean, they're vows, but what is the difference here? What is the difference between...
From the section of the catechism that you read, it makes a bit of a distinction between promises and vows. And promises in the catechism usually accompany a sacrament. So whether it's holy orders, whether it's matrimony, whether it's baptism, confirmation. So it's the promises, and you promise to fulfill the responsibilities that the sacrament enables you to do, and usually involves the priest or bishop, in the case of holy orders, conferring a specific sacramental grace that comes with the privileges and obligations of that sacrament. Vows, as you said, typically accompany some induction into a religious order. So you'll hear about a religious sister making her final vows, and this is her final profession of this is a lifelong commitment to this religious way of life. It's also the case for monks and brothers
friars, monks,
who aren't necessarily going to be ordained deacons or priests. They might be, but if they're joining a religious order, if they're becoming a Dominican, if they're being inducted into that order, they'll make specific vows that are fitting with the charisms of that order, or the specific vows of poverty, chastity, depending on what that order represents.
So when people say, during a wedding, a bride and groom say their vows or share their vows, is this using the right language?
I think, well, not in the technical terms that the Catechism uses, but I think that the vows themselves more take the form of promises, but not specific promises, because they do accompany a sacrament.
Right. And like you said, the Catechism there, 2102, says a vow is an act of devotion in which the Christian dedicates himself to God or promises him some good work. And in 2103, it says the Church recognizes an exemplary value in the vows to practice the evangelical counsels. Of course, our chastity, poverty, and obedience. So
what happens then when someone breaks a vow per se? So like things like marriage, when you break your vow of marriage and the Church calls the marriage, let's say they go for an annulment, and it says, these vows, these promises, the sacrament of marriage never really took place.
Well,
there's different ways of doing it. Like you that doesn't happen at baptism. It doesn't happen at confirmation. Those are initiation rites, and you never can get uninitiated from, you can't be unbaptized or whatever else. And the same with holy orders we talked about before, is once a priest, always a priest, but you can be taken away for your duties and your responsibilities and duties as a priest, but you're never unconsecrated as a priest, unordained as a priest. But in marriage, we do say that there's a sense of where you can have an annulment, where the marriage didn't really happen, that the people weren't fully forthright or entering into the marriage with full knowledge of the situation that they're entering into.
Yeah, well, let's be careful with our language, because like when the church declares an annulment, remember, it's to say that the marriage itself was invalid.
Invalid, okay, yeah.
Is invalid. It doesn't mean that it never took place or that it was...
Okay, but it was an invalid.
It's just saying that for whatever reason, and there are many, the people weren't in the right place to be able to exchange their consent. Gotcha. That could have been a Catholic who's married outside of the church, right? So who needs special permission? That could have been anywhere from maybe it was a situation that was forced upon them, so they were doing it with a bit of coercion or a little bit of... they weren't free to do it. It could have been something as silly as someone was drunk when they made their vows, right? So they weren't free to give their consent. So an annulment member says that the marriage was invalid. And doesn't really say, well, because someone broke their vow, we're going to give you an annulment. Unless we can say that someone from before they made their vow never had the intention of being faithful. Let's say someone who got married also had a significant other that was
or was already
spouse,
married,
or was already married, or in another relationship. So that's showing that they were not really taking seriously the promise to be faithful for the rest of their life. Then we can say, well, that marriage is invalid.
Gotcha.
When it comes to a priest who promises things, and like you say, this could be punished. He could be punished.
Yeah.
So let's take the worst example. And that it would be a priest who's been convicted of a crime.
Yeah.
Okay. So a priest that's been convicted of crime, I know there's outrage all the time from media saying, like let's say a priest who's abused minors. and they say, well, he's still a priest. Well, the priesthood is something that there's an ontological change when someone receives the sacrament of holy orders, just like baptism. Baptism confers an ontological change. Once you're baptized, you can never be unbaptized.
That's right.
Once you're baptized, you are marked now a Christian. It's like,
Your soul is
your soul is like branded, like you brand a cow or something.
Yeah.
It confers an indelible mark.
That's right. It's an indelible mark. So a priest is the same way. There's an indelible mark in the priesthood that can't be taken away. You are a priest forever, like Melchizedek of old, right? And so when the priest is convicted of a crime, of course he is removed
from ministry.
From ministry. Of course he no longer has the appropriate faculties or permissions from the bishop to act in priestly ministry or to confer sacraments or whatever it might be. But to remove that mark of priesthood,
you can't.
Right?
And further than that, they're able to be defrocked, so they're not actually allowed to wear priestly garments publicly because they're not allowed to be publicly recognized as a priest, because then that can create confusion or scandal as well.
That's right. So there are consequences to breaking the promise, right, for a priest. And a religious who also breaks their vows, maybe depending on the religious order, would have their own type of discipline there, right? So there are examples where breaking the promises and vows, there are consequences there, right? So when I want us maybe to think about that a little bit when we make promises in front of the church.
Yeah.
There should be the weight of the seriousness of that. But I feel like that's kind of
been lost.
Yeah.
I think, and like you said, when we enter into a covenant, like, so for instance, when we look at marriage, there are people that are hurt, that are injured when two people separate that have been promised in marriage, and a lot of times it's the kids. It doesn't mean that the kids are invalid, right? It doesn't mean that the kids are still a divine blessing from God. They're still given as a gift. They're baptized. They're still children of God. But people get hurt. It's an evidence that when two people who have made a covenant together separate, that there is hurt, that there is issues, that there's problems. And like you said, when a priest does the same, you can sometimes see the effects of that. But we don't always see the effects from a baptismal vow of a godparent, let's say, or even a confirmation, until it's too late. You know what I mean? Until it's almost like you get the blessing, but it's years of having to not live out your vow. And that's when you see the effects, which is that this child has no idea what their Catholic faith is when they come in. And we see it a lot of times at confirmation, unfortunately, but
we do. And like when you cooperate with the Lord, you see the fruit of that. You see the fruit of the cooperation with the Lord. So someone who's made a promise, like a godparent or a parent, you see the fruit of cooperating or following through with your promise. And sometimes, parents wonder, I think, just like you can see in a priest who's not praying, you can see in a parent who's not being a good example of faith, or you can see in the child who's not being raised in the right way. You can see that. You're right that often maybe it's too late. But I think maybe people don't realize the grace that comes with being faithful to your promise. We could see it. People would agree that we could see it in a marriage.
Yeah,
like a spouse who's faithful to their promise. You can see the fruit of that, right? So a spouse that's faithful to being faithful, who's faithful to the vows in the Catholic Church. They say, I promise to love you and to honor you all the days of my life. You can see the fruit of marriages where a spouse or both spouses do
live
that,
out that covenant.
Love and honor each other all the days. You can see that. So I think you can see the fruit of parents who take that promise very seriously.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I see
maybe not as obvious, because you would see a husband and wife fight,
Yeah.
if there's something that's like if there's a spouse that's not being faithful, for example, that leads to fighting. If there's a spouse that's not being charitable, not honoring their spouse, you see the fights happening. So maybe it's not as obvious with a parent or godparent, but I still believe that you can see the difference.
Yeah. And that language of faithfulness, of fidelity in marriage, like if extending that to other sacraments or other contexts for promises, like the idea of like being faithful to another, operating with integrity. Yes, we've talked a lot, and a lot of times we think about this in kind of the human dimension. That is like, okay, well, these are the practical consequences of not operating with integrity. You know, that faithfulness of the promise that we make to the other, we're making that promise before God. So any promise that has that gravity or that weight, that, you know, I'm not just being faithful to this community. I'm not just being faithful to my wife. Like if I'm not operating with integrity, if I'm not, you know, if my word isn't my word, you know, I have to answer to God for that. That, you know, when we talk about faithfulness, like we actually need to be people of faith. We need to like look at all of these human interactions, these relationships, these covenants in the context that, you know, we're making these before God, and that, you know, our faith informs our faithfulness.
I think it's important too to also understand, like as we're talking about this language of covenant, it's fully giving of oneself with nothing in return, right? It's fully, so a husband fully giving himself to his wife, the honor and respect, and not expecting anything in return, but the wife giving fully of herself to her husband, not expecting anything else. And that is so when you do confirmation, when you do the sacrament of holy orders or a baptism, it's the covenant that you're entering into of fully giving yourself to raising this child in the faith. It's through sacrifice. It's the full of giving, like the fullness of giving yourself. You will see God, because God's a faithful God. You are going to see the blessings. You are going to see the things, but it takes your fullness, giving yourself completely over without the expectation of anything in return. And that's when we talk about being a godparent, that's one of those things. A parent in general, but then a godparent as well, is you are taking on a commitment to give fully of yourself to this child to make sure that this is the situation that's raised without expecting anything in return, you know?
I know, I don't know if I was talking with you guys about it. I don't know, but when we talk about a godparent, I always think of like, it's probably not the best example, but I always think of like an AA sponsor.
Yeah.
Because when
You have to
someone's
have been
going
through
through like they're trying to quit drinking, they're going through AA program, the sponsor really takes their role seriously.
Yeah.
Like they're available at any
24/7.
time that the person calls with a temptation. They're there for moral support. They attend meetings with them. Like this is an image of a good sponsor, right?
Cool.
Like imagine if godparents took on the same way. Like we go with our godchildren to church.
Yeah.
We are there for them at any time. We're in the face of temptation. We're there ready to help them through.
And call us in the middle of the night.
Like, think about that.
Yeah.
Like, this is what a beautiful thing. But then when you're talking about covenant, obviously I'm always thinking about the new covenant, Jesus Christ. You know, when we celebrate the Mass, you know, this is the blood of the new covenant. You know, Jesus shed his blood. Jesus in the new covenant has given us his life, like has sacrificed everything. That's the new covenant. And we can't even honor a promise that we make at baptism in the same faith where Jesus has given his life for us. Like we're always looking at the example of what we're doing. And the example is Christ, right? So I think maybe in your marriages, in your priesthood, in your religious life, in your role as godparent or parent, whatever it might be, as a confirmation sponsor, when we say yes in front of the church, we are participating in the new covenant. We are being people who should sacrifice for the other. A spouse sacrifices for the other. A priest sacrifices for the church. A religious sacrifices for the church. A parent sacrifices for their child. A godparent does the same. Like, just like Jesus did, that's how we honor. That's why the church says fidelity to the promises made to God is a sign of respect for the respect we have for being faithful to God. I don't know. It's not rocket science.
No.
It's not rocket science.
It's calling ourselves to action, but also then calling one of the things just to kind of add in there is call as a godparent is to call your godchildren to the action if they're godparents. Is now to call them to action. Okay, you're the godparent. You made this vow. You should be doing this. Or you're a parent now. You baptized your child. You should be doing this. So it's not ever too late to be a godparent, right? Like you can hold that accountability. It's hard if you didn't foster a relationship with that child from the get go. I mean, Uncle Josh is calling you from in the middle of like haven't talked to him in 35 years, and all of a sudden I'm going to call in just like you should start going to church.
Are you going to church? Yeah.
It's through sincerity of a relationship, but
So maybe we can reflect on that this week because maybe it's something that we can reflect on. We've all made promises. I think we've all made promises in front of the church, and so are we being faithful to those promises? Are we being people who recognize the weight of those promises?
let our yes be yes, our no be no.
Let our yes be yes and our no. But and you know what's funny when you think of promises or you think of vows in the church? Probably the first thing that comes. Probably everyone has a story about someone who hasn't honored their promise. But why can't we be celebrating rather people who have, right? So maybe this week, all of us together as a podcast family can reflect on, can we be a little more faithful to our promise and pray for people, pray for those new parents who have baptized their children, pray for godparents who are taking on the role, pray for priests and religious, pray for married couples, those couples maybe who are going through a difficult time. Let's be faithful to God. And let's be examples of, the new covenant, the one that Jesus showed us how to make a promise, how to make a vow, how to make a covenant. That's all the time. So maybe if you want to comment on anything we've said today, you can drop it here on on these social media platforms that you find our podcast on, or you can send us an email at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.